Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The morning draped the village in a veil of mist, its hills softened by the dawn's gentle breath, but Deep carried no softness within her. She stood at the edge of her bamboo shack, her hands clutching a basket of cold rice and salt, her eyes tracing the dirt path that wound toward the market like a ribbon of red earth. The air was thick with the scent of dew and charcoal, woven with the distant hum of a waterfall nestled among pines. Roosters crowed, their calls sharp against the hush, and a child's laugh drifted from a nearby house, fading into the hills. Hockey, her little dog, nudged her ankle, his tail a faint wag in the gray light, but even his warmth couldn't lift the weight that had settled in her chest. Yesterday she'd faced James's father, his words a stone that had crushed her dreams. "You're poor with a past. You're not for my son." She knelt by the doorstep, setting the basket down, its contents a stark mirror of her life, simple, unyielding, enough to keep her and Hockey alive, but not enough to bridge the chasm between her and James. The path gleamed under the rising sun, slick from the night's rain, and she thought of the stream where she'd stood with James months ago. His hand warm in hers, his voice bright with promises. "This land Deep," he'd said, gesturing to the fields that stretched wide under the mountain's watchful gaze. "It's ours. We'll grow a home here, maybe children someday." She believed him then, her heart as open as the sky, thinking love could root deeper than the rice they planted. But now those dreams felt like ash, scattered by his father's verdict, sharp and final. Deep rose, brushing dirt from her skirt, and fed Hockey the rice, her hands trembling as she mixed in a pinch of fish sauce and a whisper of emetic. "Eat, little one," she murmured, her voice barely above the wind. "It's what we've got." Hockey tilted his head, his eyes bright with trust, and she envied his simplicity, his world untouched by judgment or scorn. She thought of her mother, gone these many years, who taught her to plant by the moon's phases, to husk corn with care, to carry on when the world grew heavy. "Your heart is your strength," her mother had said, her hands rough but tender, and Deep clung to those words now, letting them anchor her against the pain that surged like a flood. But James's father had seen no strength in her. Only poverty, only a past she hadn't chosen, a marriage forced upon her when she was barely more than a child. Her mother's face rose in her mind, clear as the morning light, her eyes crinkled with laughter, her voice soft as she spoke of the land. They'd sat together once under a banyan tree by the village well, shelling peanuts as the sun dipped low. "This earth," her mother had said, "it holds you deep. It doesn't care if you're poor or rich. It gives to those who work it." That day, Deep had laughed, her fingers sticky with peanut dust, thinking life was as simple as the earth beneath her feet. Now she wondered if her mother had known how heavy the world could be, how love could lift you up only to let you fall. She'd wanted to make her mother proud, to build a life that honored those lessons, but James's father had looked through her, his voice cold. "The poor have no right to speak." Yesterday she'd walked to the market, her savings clutched tight, determined to face him as more than the girl he scorned. The shop had smelled of cloth and dust, its shelves piled with clothes she'd never dared touch. She'd chosen a dress, its blue soft as dusk, and shoes that pinched but gleamed under the shop's dim light. 350,000 dong, the shopkeeper had said, her hands quick with the abacus, and Deep had handed over the bills, her heart pounding. She'd wanted to look worthy, to stand before James's father and say, "I love your son, and he loves me. We're not so different." She'd practiced the words on the path, her voice mingling with the rustle of bamboo, imagining his nod, his acceptance. But the dress hadn't changed his eyes, cold as stone, nor his words. "You were sold as a wife. My family is rich. You don't belong." She'd gone to the tea shop anyway, her steps unsteady, the dress stiff against her skin. The room had smelled of jasmine and smoke, its tables worn but clean. She'd sat across from him, her hands folded, and spoken of love, of effort, of the books she read by lamplight. "I'm learning," she'd said. "James teaches me. Poverty isn't a sin." But he'd shaken his head, his voice a blade. "Accept your fate. Let my son go." She'd wanted to argue, to tell him of the nights she'd spent tracing words in the primer, of the dream she held for a life beyond her shack. But her tongue had faltered, pinned by the fear that he was right, that she was reaching for a star that would burn her. Deep started down the path now, Hockey trotting at her heels, the basket empty but heavy with memory. The village was waking, its rhythm as familiar as her own heartbeat. Smoke curled from thatched roofs, weaving patterns in the dawn, and the scent of boiling rice mingled with the tang of wet earth and jasmine. Her shack lay behind her, its walls weathered but steadfast, a small world she'd carved out alone. She thought of the fields beyond, where she'd worked James's land, planting eggplant and cabbage under the sun's unrelenting gaze. A woman named Hwin had shown her the rows 2 days ago, her voice steady as she spoke of soil and profit. 10,000 dong a kilo, she'd said, pointing to the purple fruit. Better than rice. Deep had nodded, but her mind had been on the meeting she'd fought to have, on the hope she'd carried like a fragile flame. Hwin's farm had stretched wide under the hills, its rows neat despite the dry season's bite. Manure, not chemicals, Hwin had said, her hands stained with earth. It keeps the soil alive. Deep had listened, her fingers brushing the leaves of a melon plant, its fruit heavy but rough from lack of light. She'd seen herself in those plants, struggling to grow in a world that didn't always give enough light, water, or kindness. Hwin had spoken of profit, of trucks that carried their harvest to distant markets, but Deep had heard something else, a way to root herself deeper, to prove she was more than James's father saw. She'd walked away with a seed in her pocket, a small gift from Hwin, and the thought that maybe she could plant something new, a crop, a skill, a life. The market came into view, its stalls a patchwork of color under tamarind trees. She had no potatoes to sell today, no corn to weigh, but she lingered, her feet rooted to the earth. Buyers drifted by, their voices a soft hum, and she remembered her mother's laughter here, her hands quick with a scale, her smile a beacon in the bustle. Sell with pride, she'd said, and Deep had tried, but pride was hard to hold when James's father had dismissed her, his voice echoing, "You've been sold as a wife." Her mother had known the market's pulse, its people woven into her days, and Deep felt their eyes now, kind but curious, sensing her silence. An old man, his face etched like tree bark, paused by her side. "No basket today, child?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head, forcing a smile, and he pressed a mango into her hand, its skin warm from the sun. "For strength," he said, and walked on, leaving her with a lump in her throat. She thought of her grandmother, who'd sat with her under the stars, telling stories of bamboo flutes carved from rice stalks, blown to call the rain when drought scorched the land. "The gods listen," her grandmother had said, her eyes crinkling with faith, and as a child Deep had believed it, blowing tunes until her breath ran dry. They'd lain on a mat by the river, the night alive with fireflies, and her grandmother had traced constellations, naming them for dreamers who defied the odds. "You're one of them," she'd whispered, and Deep had carried that whisper through the years, a spark against the dark. Now she wasn't sure what she believed, only that she loved James with a fierceness that scared her, and she'd fought for him. Fought with words, with hope, with a dress that cost her everything. Deep turned from the market, her steps leading her to the stream that cut through the valley. Its waters glinted under the noon sun, a ribbon of light against the earth. She sat on its bank, hockey curling beside her, and let her fingers trail in the current, its chill a fleeting balm. Her past rose unbidden, a shadow she couldn't shake. Years ago, her family, desperate, had sold her to a man she barely knew. A marriage that wasn't love but labor, a debt she'd paid with silent tears. It had ended, leaving her free but marked, a scar James's father had wielded like a weapon. "You were sold," he'd said, as if it defined her, but she refused to let it. She'd built this life, her shack, her work, her love for James, with her own hands, and she'd fight to keep it, if only she knew how. She thought of James now, somewhere in the village, his face taut with worry. He'd found her yesterday, after she'd fled the tea shop, her eyes red from tears she couldn't hide. "Deep, what's wrong?" he'd asked, his voice soft, his hands holding a table and chairs he'd bought for her shack, a gift that felt like a promise. She'd wanted to tell him, to spill the pain that choked her, but the words had stuck, heavy as clay. "I need space," she'd said, her voice breaking, and watched him walk away, his shoulders slumped, his confusion a mirror to her own. James had stood in her doorway, the dusk framing him, and she'd seen the boy beneath the CO, the boy who'd laughed with her in the fields, who'd taught her to read by lantern light. He'd promised to return, his voice earnest, before the rooster crows. But what would he bring, defiance or the weight of his father's will? James, too, carried his own burdens, though Deep could only guess at them. She pictured him now, in the house at the village's edge, its walls lined with wealth she'd never touch. He'd spoken of projects yesterday, his voice tight with caution. Ghost schemes that could steal his fortune. Workers waiting for wood bonuses to plan. "I have to be careful," he told a friend, and she'd heard the strain, the weight of a world she didn't fully know. But he'd chosen her, hadn't he? He'd sat with her under the tamarind tree, his hand brushing hers, and said, "You're enough, deep." Yet his father's words had sown doubt, and her silence yesterday had deepened it, leaving them both adrift. The stream whispered, its voice endless, and she spoke to it, her words barely audible. "Poverty isn't a sin, is it? I didn't choose that life, but I chose him." Haki stirred, his ears pricking at a sound she hadn't heard, footsteps, soft on the path. She turned, her heart quickening, but it was only a boy, his basket full of greens, his smile shy. "Auntie Deep," he said, "you forgot your change yesterday." He pressed a coin into her hand, its weight small but real, and she nodded, her throat tight. The village carried on, its people woven into her days, their kindness a thread that held her together. She thought of Hwin's farm, the eggplant rose, the talk of profit and soil. "Better than rice," Hwin had said, and Deep had seen a path there, a way to grow beyond her shack, to prove she was more than James's father saw. Dusk settled, painting the hills in shades of gold and shadow. Deep walked home, Haki at her heels, the coin and mango warm in her palm. The village was quiet now, its bustle giving way to evening's hush. Fireflies blinked in the distance, and the air carried the scent of jasmine and wood smoke, wrapping her in a fleeting peace. Her shack came into view, its walls a patchwork of bamboo and memory, and she braced herself for the emptiness inside. She lit the stove, the flames casting shadows that danced like ghosts of her past. She sliced greens, their bitterness sharp in the air, and set rice to boil, but her hands trembled, betraying the calm she tried to hold. The book on the table caught her eye, a worn primer she'd borrowed, its pages filled with words she struggled to grasp. She traced the cover, her fingers lingering on the faded ink. She'd wanted to learn, to grow, not just for James but for herself, for the girl who dreamed of more than baskets and fields. Her mother had never learned to read, but she carried a wisdom deeper than words, teaching Deep to listen to the earth, to trust her own heart. Now that heart was torn between love and fear, between holding on and letting go. She thought of her first marriage, a bitter chapter forced upon her, a scar James's father had used to wound her. But she'd survived it, hadn't she? She'd walked away, built this shack, found James. Maybe that was enough to start again. She stepped outside, Haki at her heels, and looked up at the sky. The moon hung low, its light spilling through the trees, painting the ground in silver. She thought of the stories her mother had told, of women who'd loved against the odds, who'd faced scorn and stood tall. "The heart knows its own path," her mother had said, and Deep wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that her love for James was enough. But his father's words lingered, sharp as thorns, and James's silence yesterday, his confusion, was a weight she couldn't shake. She spoke to Haki, her voice soft. "You're my only friend, aren't you? You don't care that I'm poor." Sleep came fitfully, broken by the rustle of leaves and Haki's soft whines. In her dreams she saw James's father, his eyes unreadable, standing at the edge of the fields, his words a chant. "You're not enough." She reached for James, but he was gone, leaving only the sound of water rushing over stones, endless and cold. She woke to dawn's first light, her body weary but her resolve flickering, a small flame that refused to die. She rose, fed Haki, and packed her basket, though she had nothing to sell. The market awaited, the village awaited, life awaited. As she stepped onto the path, the mist curling around her like a shawl, she thought of James. He'd promised to return, his voice earnest. "Before the rooster crows," he'd said. Would he come with answers, with defiance, or with the same silence that had followed her yesterday? She thought of his father, of the wall he'd built between them, and of her own heart, battered but unbroken. The path stretched ahead, winding through hills that held both her past and her future. She shifted her basket, its weight grounding her, steadying her steps. Today she'd walk to the market, nod to strangers and carry on, her heart a quiet drumbeat against the morning's song. But in that heart a question lingered, soft as moonlight, sharp as stone. Would love be enough to hold them together? Or would it slip through her fingers like water from the stream? The answer wasn't here, not yet. It lay somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the hills, in a moment she couldn't yet see. For now Deep walked on, her steps steady, her soul a flickering flame that burned against the dawn.